This is the Tom Bigby Tales, and I'm your host, Shannon Evans. I write about a small town in northeast Mississippi on the Tom Bigby River called Columbus. And sometimes I write about the rest of the state. This episode is titled Frank Miller and Karl Jung. I recently did an episode on a young woman from Columbus, Lucy Neilson, whose journal entries from 1860 to 1865, the Civil War years, were included. I then read Lucy's collection of letters from late to post-Reconstruction era when she was a wee bit older. Those letters provide insights into the life of a modest newlywed navigating into adulthood post-Civil War. It is mostly superficial, newsy letters, but based on her early journals from post-boarding school, I was not expecting much more from them. I did glean that she maintained kindly relationships with the formerly enslaved house servants, carriage drivers, and the groom. But other than that, I did not find much of anything interesting to investigate about her adult life. I had decided to see if I could find out what happened to her brother's wife, Harriet. Now, if you'll remember, that was the socialite who left Lucy and Harriet's daughter in Georgia because Harriet was afraid she'd get cut off from home and stuck behind enemy lines, and I'm sure she felt she'd miss out on some of her shopping adventures. So she leaves her young sister-in-law, who's about 18 at the time, and her own daughter to their own devices with distant relatives in Georgia. Harriet, while selfish and a horrible mother, actually sounded more interesting to investigate. Unfortunately, Harriet died in 1865, but her daughter Bessie, whose full name was Elizabeth Parthenia Irion Miller, was more interesting. She married Frank Miller in Lucy Neilson's home in Columbus, Mississippi. Frank Miller was from a fairly well-to-do Mobile, Alabama banking family. Okay, while the marrying part is not that interesting, but what is interesting is uh, Elizabeth, or Bessie, was buried in East Finchley in London in 1937. Bessie had married Frank in 1876, and they had two daughters, Frank Miller and Harriet Hayden Miller. Bessie's husband, Franklin Williams Miller, was born in 1847 in Massachusetts and died in New York City in 1931 at age 83. Miller's father had moved to Mobile soon after Frank's birth and became a well-respected, quite prominent merchant and then banker in Mobile. His son, Frank Sr., became a prominent financial broker in Mobile. Frank Sr.'s wife, Bessie, at some point moves to London after his death to live with her daughter, Harriet, and her husband, the Reverend Henry Dexter. She dies there of a heart attack and was buried at St. Pancras Cemetery in East Finchley near King's Cross in central London. End of a boring story? Well, not exactly. I began looking into the life of Bessie's children, starting with daughter Harriet. Harriet was born in Mobile in February of 1882. In 1927, we find her, age 45, listed on the manifest of the ship American Shipper, with a New York City address listing as having departed London. Harriet does not really show up again until her mother's death certificate in London. However, we do know, based on some of her mother's paperwork, that Harriet, along with her sister Frank, I'm going to call her Frank Jr., and they traveled extensively abroad and studied abroad. But let's fast forward. The older sister, Frank Miller, I'm going to call her Junior, named after their father, is a different story. Frank was born in Mobile, Alabama in 1878. Her father's her father and uncles worked at the family's bank where her father was an investor. Now, Frank grows up and is a beautiful woman in the classic sense. She had I left out a little bit. Let me put a little bit more back in there. Before I describe Frank, let me tell you more about her family. In 1888, their family bank failed, and Frank Sr. moved the whole family to Atlanta, where he became involved in stocks and bonds and made another fortune. They were staunch Presbyterians like their Columbus family. As a young woman, Frank competed for the Demarest Medal that honored William Jennings Demarest, a famous orator. She won in 1894. As and she's probably by the end of that year, her family had moved to New York City, and that was when she and her sister were sent to study abroad. Now, back to the description. She was a beautiful young woman in a classic sense. I found a photo of her. She had soft brown hair, large dark eyes, bow-shaped lips, and a cleft chin. She was a talented writer by all indications and highly educated, especially in mythology. There are several records of her traveling back and forth to New York or Mobile from England via various ships, but also on ships owned by her father. At some point prior to 1911, Frank became the patient of the noted experimental psychologist Thomas Theodore Flerney. Frank wrote a 20-page treatise while traveling through Europe on her grand tour with her sister and mother, and it was upon working with Flerney that he encouraged her to publish some instances of subconscious creative imagination in 1905 in the Archives of Psychology. It was written in French. It was reminiscent of mythology and spiritualism that was growing popular at that time. Her work was filled with her fantasies. Frank was by then a lecturer slash costume performer of history on the Chautauqua circuit. In, in 1908, at age 30, Frank would be admitted into Danvers Hospital, a mental asylum in the rural area north of Boston. She was diagnosed as having psychopathic personality and a tendency for hypermania. She was discharged in 1905, and at that time she moved to Austin, Texas, and enrolled in the University of Texas, where she joined a local chapter of the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. Then we don't find her again until about 1920, when her sister married and moved to England, where they would both spend the rest of their lives. And Frank would move there and die in 1927 in the Horton Mental Hospital. She is interred in their cemetery. So, what does Frank have to do with Jung? Jung was given her 20-page Fantasy Symbols of Transformation article by another psychotherapist, and it became the unifying piece he needed to finally craft transformations and symbols of the libido as one of his most significant works. It was the piece he needed to write in order to break away from Freud. It was his rewriting of the Oedipal story to broaden the term libido that her work was the catalyst and the influence that he needed to solidify those notes and ideas into that solid theoretical underpinning, and it would also become the underpinning of his future work. All of this from the great niece of a Columbus resident. I want to thank you for coming on my tour of the Tombigbee Tales and hearing yet another fanciful piece of history about Columbus and some of its people, even if they did move to Mobile. Thank you again, and until next time.